The cabin was a joke. Everyone in the Crow Wing County settlement knew it was a joke. Hannah Kepler knew it was a joke. Even the man who gave it to her, Friedrich Metz, knew it was a joke, which was why he gave it to her instead of the other thing she was entitled to, which was half of everything her husband Carl had built on the Minnesota Territory claim over 3 years of labor. Friedrich Metz was Carl Kepler's business partner. They had come from Württemberg together in 1853, had filed adjacent claims on the Crow Wing River drainage, had pooled their labor and their capital through 3 seasons of breaking land and building and planting and harvesting. The partnership agreement was a handshake agreement, the kind that worked perfectly as long as both parties were alive and were the kind of men they had been when they shook hands. Carl died in September of 1857. He died of the same fever that moved through the Crow Wing settlements that year and took 11 other people and left their families with the arithmetic. He died in a week, which was how the fever worked when it worked badly, fast enough that a man who had been strong on Tuesday was gone by the following Tuesday and had not thought to put anything in writing because strong men on Tuesday did not think about the following Tuesday. Friedrich Metz arrived at the Kepler cabin on the 3rd day after the burial. He was not a villain. He was a man who had been in Minnesota Territory for 4 years and had watched the arithmetic of frontier partnership go wrong in both directions, watched men work together and prosper, and watched men work together and one of them die and the other one try to be decent about it and end up losing the thing they had both built. He had a wife in Württemberg he was sending money to. He had children in Württemberg he was sending money to. He was 48 years old, and he was alone in the Minnesota Territory winter with a farm that had finally, after 3 years, begun to produce enough to justify the letters he was writing home. He came on the 3rd day, and he sat down at Hannah's table, and he told her what he had worked out, and what he believed was right, and what he could offer. What he had worked out was that the claim was in Carl's name, filed by Carl, improved by Carl and Friedrich together, and that without a will, the claim disposition was complicated in a way he had already spoken to the county land agent about. What he believed was right was that Hannah should have something. He was not a monster. He was a man who had sat down with an arithmetic problem and was presenting his solution. What he could offer was the claim shanty on the North 40. The claim shanty was a structure Carl and Friedrich had built in the spring of 1854 as their first shelter when they arrived, before the main cabin. It was 10 feet by 12 feet, built of green cottonwood timber that had warped and shrunk through 3 years of Minnesota seasons until the walls had gaps you could see daylight through. It had a dirt floor and a rusted iron stove that Friedrich had replaced with a better one the previous spring and moved to the main cabin. It sat on the exposed north slope of the ridge, which was the slope that caught every northwest wind that came down from the Canadian border in winter, unprotected by any tree line or natural feature. Carl had been using it as a tool storage shed for 2 years. Friedrich said, "You can have the shanty and the North 40 acres, and the $20 I am prepared to offer as a settlement." Hannah looked at him across the table. She was 48 years old, broad through the face and hands, with the bearing of a woman who had worked beside her husband for 15 years and had done the work his equal and knew it. She had dark hair, going grey at the temples, and the kind of eyes that catalogued information without appearing to, she said, and the furniture and the kitchen goods. He had not thought she would ask for specifics. He said, "The furniture is part of the claim." She said, "The furniture came from Germany in 1853. In the shipping crate I packed myself. The kitchen goods were purchased with money from the sale of my mother's household in Württemberg before we left." She said this without heat, as facts. "The claim is Carl's labor. The household contents are mine." He thought about this. He said, "The kitchen goods." She said, "And the furniture." He said, "The table and the chairs, not the wardrobe." She said, "The wardrobe came from my mother's house." He knew the wardrobe had come from her mother's house. He had helped Carl carry it from the wagon in 1853. He said, "The wardrobe." She said, "And the seed potatoes in the root cellar." "Half of them." He said, "Half." She said, "Yes." He agreed. He agreed because he had expected resistance to the $20, and she had not resisted the $20. And he understood in the way that practical men understood things, that when a person concedes the large number without argument, they have a reason, and the reason was not yet visible to him, and he was not certain he wanted it to be. He helped her move the furniture to the shanty on a cold October afternoon. 2 weeks after Carl's burial, the wardrobe and the table and the chairs and the kitchen goods and the bedding and the seed potatoes in their half of the root cellar bags. He helped her move it with the guilty efficiency of a man who needed the task completed before he thought about it too much. He went back to the main cabin, and she was alone with the shanty, and 6 weeks before the first hard frost. She spent the first 2 days not building anything. She spent the first 2 days looking. This was something Carl had taught her, not as a lesson, but as a habit she had watched him practice every time he confronted something he did not know how to do yet. He would stop and look before he touched anything. He would stand in the field before he broke the first ground and read the drainage and the slope and the root density. He would stand in the timber before he chose a tree and read the lean and the grain. He would look until the thing told him what it needed. He had taught her this without knowing he was teaching it, which was the best kind of teaching. She looked at the shanty. It was, as everyone in the settlement had said, and as she could see plainly, inadequate. The walls were single-thickness cottonwood planking, dried and shrunk and gapped, with the kind of chinking between the planks that had been adequate for a tool shed in summer and would be lethal in a Minnesota winter at -30. The roof was boards with a sod layer on top, the sod having dried and shrunk and separated at the joints so that the roof had gaps that admitted a February wind the same way the walls did. The stove was gone. There was a stovepipe hole in the north wall where it had stood. She looked at all this and noted it. Then she stopped looking at the shanty and started looking at what surrounded it. The shanty sat on the north slope of the ridge. The ridge itself ran east to west, and the north slope below the ridge was the exposed face, which was why the main cabin was on the south slope, which was why Friedrich had wanted the main cabin and had given her this one. She stood at the shanty's east wall and looked at the slope and the way the fall light moved across it, and she thought about what winter would do here, and what winter would do there, and what the difference was. Then she looked down. The ground at the base of the shanty walls was Minnesota clay, dark and heavy, still unfrozen. She crouched and pressed her hand to the soil at the base of the north wall. It was cool. She pressed it in deeper, 3 inches, 4 inches, warmer. She pressed in as far as her hand would go, 6 inches below the surface, notably warmer. She had pressed her hands into the earth before. She had been pressing her hands into the earth in different countries since she was a child and knew what it told her. The earth below 4 or 5 inches was warmer than the surface. In summer it was cooler than the surface. This was why you stored food underground. This was why root cellars worked in any climate in the world where anyone had ever built one. But she had not thought about it the way she was thinking about it now. If the earth 6 inches down was warmer than the air at the surface in November, then the earth pressing against the outside of a wall was warmer than the air pressing against the outside of a wall, which meant the earth was a better insulation layer than air, which meant a wall buried in earth lost heat more slowly than a wall exposed to air. She stood up and looked at the 4 walls of the shanty. She looked at the tools she had brought from Carl's workshop. The spade, the mattock, the wheelbarrow, the broadaxe, the handsaw, the hammer and nail tin. She picked up the spade and began to dig. She started on the north wall, which was the windward wall, the wall that faced whatever came down from Canada in winter. She dug a trench along the base of the north wall, 2 feet out from the wall and 2 feet deep, running the full 12-foot width. The Minnesota clay came up in dense, heavy slabs, dark and heavy, the kind of soil that packed tight and held its shape. She loaded it into the wheelbarrow and moved it to the side. At 2 feet deep, the soil in the trench bottom was markedly warmer than the surface soil. She could feel it on her hands, the warmth of earth that had not yet felt the October air, the warmth the earth carried from its own heat and from the summer sun it had stored through the growing season. She kept digging, 3 feet deep. The trench walls were holding their shape, the clay dense enough to stand vertical. The bottom was warm. She moved her wheelbarrow loads of excavated clay to the north side of the trench, building a pile that was beginning, after 4 hours, to look like something. She worked until the light failed. The next morning she was back before full light, digging the east wall trench. The east wall was 12 feet long, the same as the north wall. She dug the same configuration, 2 feet out, 2 feet deep, the full length of the wall. She moved the excavated earth to the growing pile on the north side. Then the south wall, which was the wall the door was in, and which faced away from the prevailing wind. She dug the south wall trench more shallowly, 18 inches rather than 2 feet, because the south wall was not the primary problem. The door she left accessible. She dug the trench around the door opening, leaving a 3-foot gap at the threshold for access. The west wall completed the rectangle. It took her 4 days to dig the trench, working from first light to last. At the end of the 4th day, she had a rectangle of open trench 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep, running around all 4 sides of the shanty, with the excavated earth piled on the trench's outer edge. She stood back and looked at it. The trench looked like what it was, a rectangle dug in the earth around a building, which was not a thing anyone in the Crow Wing County settlement had seen before, and which several of the settlement's residents had ridden past during the 4 days of digging and observed without comment to her, though with considerable comment to each other. She had heard from her 3rd day of digging what they were saying. The settlement was small enough that what one person said to another reached the 3rd person by the following morning. She had heard the word Wahnsinn, which was German for madness, used in 2 conversations she had not been part of. She had heard her name used in a sentence that contained also the word Graben, which was the word for trench or grave, in a tone that made the 2 meanings of the word carry equal weight. She went back to work. The next task was the berms. She had been planning the berms while she was digging the trench, working out the geometry and the sequence the way Carl had worked out problems, by looking at them from all angles before touching anything. The excavated earth from the trench was going to go back against the shanty walls, not into the trench. Against the walls, on top of the ground surface, pushed and packed up the wall face in a thick sloping bank that would run from ground level up to 4 feet high on each wall. 4 feet of packed earth against a wall was the difference between a thin wooden wall exposed to -30 air and a thin wooden wall backed by a mass of earth at near ground temperature. The earth in contact with the wall would be warmer than the outside air. For the same reason the trench bottom had been warm. The Earth's thermal mass resisted temperature change. A wall backed by 4 feet of packed earth was not losing heat to the -30 air. It was losing heat to the earth, which was much closer to the wall's own temperature. She began moving the piled, excavated earth back against the walls. This was heavier work than the digging, because she was moving wet clay uphill against a vertical surface and packing it in place. She used the mattock to break up the larger clods and the back of the spade to tamp and compress the earth as she built the berm up. She worked in layers, 6 inches of earth, tamped solid, then 6 more inches, tamped again, making sure each layer was compressed tight against the wall face and tight against the layer below. The berm needed to be dense. Loose earth held air pockets that reduced the insulating value. Dense, packed earth was the insulator. She had pressed her hand into this same soil 6 inches down and felt the warmth. That warmth required the earth to be dense and continuous, a solid mass, not a pile of loose clods with air spaces. She worked the north berm first, because the north berm was the critical one, the one that stood between the shanty and the prevailing northwest wind. By the end of the first day of berm building, she had the north berm up to 3 feet on the north wall, tamped solid, sloping back from the wall face to ground level at a 45-degree angle. She pressed her hand into the packed berm at its mid-height, dense and warm. Warmer already than the surface soil, because the packed mass retained the temperature the trench bottom had shown her. She went to sleep that night on the sleeping platform she had built from the wardrobe's shelving, repurposed, raised 8 inches off the dirt floor on the table's turned legs, covered with the bedding from the main cabin. The shanty was cold, 12 degrees above what the outside night was, which was improvement over nothing and not enough to sustain anyone through a Minnesota winter, but she had no stove yet, and the berms were not finished. She was not done. On the 6th day, Friedrich Metz rode past on his way to the mill and stopped his horse at the edge of the road and looked at the shanty. The north berm was complete. The east berm was 3/4 done. The south berm was begun. The west berm was the pile of excavated earth waiting to be moved. The trenches were still open, raw clay walls showing, the excavated earth against the berm faces in various stages of tamping and completion. Friedrich looked at it for a long time. Then he rode on. He said nothing to her. She was inside working when he passed, and she did not go out to him, and he did not knock. She heard his horse, and she knew who it was, because she knew the sound of his horse, and she let him pass without offering any explanation, because the explanation was going to be the winter, and she was not going to the trouble of a word when the temperature would say it better. She finished the berms on the 8th day, 4 walls bermed to 4 feet, packed earth sloping from wall face to ground, compressed tight and solid, the clay beginning to dry and harden in the October air. She had used all of the excavated trench material. The trench itself was now the foundation drainage system, the open rectangle at the outer base of the berms that would catch any water that ran down the berm faces and carry it away from the shanty walls. She stood back and looked at what she had built. The shanty was still visible above the berm line, the top 3 feet of wall and the roof exposed to the air. But the lower 4 feet of every wall were now backed by a solid mass of packed clay earth that extended 2 feet out from the walls at the base and sloped to the ground surface at 4 feet high. The shanty looked, from the road, like something that had been pushed into the earth rather than built on top of it, which was precisely what had happened. The next day, she addressed the roof. The roof was the other critical problem. Heat rises. In a poorly insulated building, a significant portion of the fire's heat went up through the ceiling and out through the roof. The shanty's sod roof had been adequate for a tool shed in summer, but was a colander for winter heat. She needed more mass on the roof. She could not add more soil easily, not from the ground, because the roof boards were already bearing the weight of the existing sod layer, and she was not confident they would bear significantly more without additional support. What she could add was something lighter than soil, but still insulating. She spent 2 days in the creek bottom, collecting dried grass, the dead prairie grass and creek reeds that the autumn had dried to a dense tan mat. She cut it in armfuls and loaded it into the wheelbarrow and brought it to the shanty. She climbed the roof and laid the dried grass in a 4-inch layer over the entire sod surface, packing it down with her hands, and then covered the grass layer with a thin skim of clay slurry she had mixed from the trench scrapings and creek water, sealing the grass in place and shedding rain. The dried grass layer was not as good as added earth would have been, but it was 12 pounds per square foot rather than 100 pounds, and it provided significant additional insulation between the interior ceiling and the outside cold. She came down from the roof on the 2nd day and looked at the structure. She was tired in the specific way of someone who has been doing physical work for 10 days straight in October cold. Her hands were so cracked and clay-stained that washing them produced no visible change in their color. She had been eating once a day to conserve her supplies. She was not done. She went to the settlement. The Crow Wing County settlement was 2 miles east on the River Road, a collection of farms and the small commercial cluster that a frontier community built around a mill and a store and a church. She went to the general store, where Gerhard Schreiber kept goods and credit accounts and information in roughly equal quantities. She needed 2 things she did not have and could not make. The first was a stove. The rusted hulk that Friedrich had pulled from the shanty and replaced with a better one was still in Friedrich's tool shed. She had seen it when she was moving her furniture. She went to Friedrich Metz's neighbor, a man named Hans Büchner, who had a small iron stove he had been meaning to repair and had not gotten to, and she traded him 2 of her $20 for it, plus the materials to fix the cracked firebox plate, which she fixed herself with the cold chisel and a piece of flat iron she found in Carl's toolbox. The second thing she needed was straw, not dried grass from the creek, which was loose and fibrous and would settle and shift. Straw, the tightly bound bales of grain straw from the harvest, which packed densely and held its shape and had been used for insulation in northern European farming for longer than any of the settlers in Crow Wing County had been alive. She needed straw bales to face the outer surface of the earth berms, to add a second layer of insulation on top of the clay, and to protect the clay berm faces from the direct action of the wind. Gerhard Schreiber had straw. He had more straw than he could use, because straw was a byproduct of the harvest that accumulated faster than it could be used as animal bedding, and everyone sold their surplus at the end of October, before the winter made it inconvenient. She bought 8 bales of wheat straw for 60 cents. She carried the straw home in 2 trips on the wheelbarrow, which was the maximum load the wheelbarrow would take on the rutted November road, and she spent 2 days setting the bales against the outer face of the earth berms. She set them on edge, the flat bale face against the clay berm, packed tight against each other, filling in the gaps between bales with loose straw rammed in with the back of the hatchet. The straw bales added another 18 inches of insulation to the outer face of the clay berm. The total insulation envelope on the north wall was now 4 feet of packed clay berm plus 18 inches of packed straw bale from outside to the shanty wall. The combined effect was an insulation layer 6 feet deep between the Minnesota winter and the cottonwood wall of the shanty. She set the iron stove in the center of the room and cut a new stovepipe hole in the roof, sealing the old north wall hole with a piece of board and clay. She hauled wood from the creek bottom and stacked it against the east berm, covered with a piece of oilcloth she had kept from the packing materials in 1853. She was finished 3 days before the first hard frost. The first hard frost arrived on November 3rd, the temperature dropping to 12 degrees on the surface. Inside the shanty, with the stove burning a modest fire, the temperature was 58 degrees. She checked this with the household thermometer she had brought from the main cabin, hanging it on the south interior wall where Carl had always kept it in the main cabin. The second night, the temperature outside dropped to -4. Inside, with the stove at low burn, the temperature was 52 degrees. Not comfortable. Survivable. Very much warmer than a thin-walled cottonwood shanty with single-thickness plank walls should have been at -4 outside. She checked the north exterior wall by going outside in the dark and pressing her hand against the straw bale face. The straw was cold on its outer surface, absorbing the night air. She pushed her hand into the straw, deeper, 6 inches in. Warmer. She pushed her hand through to the clay berm behind the straw. Warmer still. She pushed her fingers into the clay as far as they would go. The clay at the back, against the shanty wall, was 38 degrees. The outside air was -4. The wall of the shanty was losing heat to 38-degree earth, not to -4 air. She stood in the dark at -4 and thought about this. A timber wall, 1 inch thick, losing heat to -4 air was losing it at a rate determined by the full 40-degree difference between the wall's interior temperature and the air outside. The same wall losing heat to 38-degree Earth was losing it at a rate determined by a 16-degree difference. The wall was doing less than half the work. The fire was doing less than half the work. The wood was going to last more than twice as long. She went back inside and sat by the stove and did the arithmetic. She had what she judged to be 4 cord of wood stacked beside the east berm, covered with the oilcloth. A standard Minnesota Territory cabin burned between 8 and 12 cord in a hard winter. She had planned, if the berms worked as she expected, to need considerably less. The arithmetic from her first real night was telling her she had been right to plan that way. She wrote in her account book by lamplight the outdoor temperature and the indoor temperature and the temperature of the clay at the berm's inner face. She wrote this the way Carl had kept farm records, in the plain numbered columns of a person who kept track of things, because things you tracked were things you could understand. She was going to track this all winter, November. The November routine was established in the first week and held. She rose before light, lay still on the sleeping platform, gauging the temperature by the feel of the air on her face, then rose and fed the stove and made coffee and went outside to check the outdoor thermometer she had hung on the south berm stake and the temperature of the clay at the inner berm face and write both numbers in the account book. She cut wood 3 mornings a week. The creek bottom east of the shanty had deadfall in quantity, mature cottonwood and ash that the summer storms had put down. She cut what had fallen rather than what was standing, because standing timber was harder, and because standing timber was Carl's timber, or Friedrich's timber, or the settlement's timber, and she had what she had, and it was enough. She was alone. She had been alone on the claim since Carl's death in September, and she had found the solitude to be 2 things simultaneously. The specific grief of a person who was in a place that held the shape of another person and constantly reminded them of the absence, and a clarity of attention that she had not had when there were 2 of them managing the decisions of a frontier farm together. She was making every decision herself, and she was making them cleanly because there was no one to discuss them with, and discussion, she found, was sometimes a way of diffusing responsibility rather than sharing it. She went to the settlement once a week, on Saturdays, to Gerhard Schreiber's store. She bought what she needed and listened to the settlement talk, which was her information source about what was happening on the river drainage and what the winter looked like and which families were in difficulty. The talk about her was not unfriendly. It was what talk about unusual things usually was on the frontier, which was a mixture of curiosity and skepticism and the particular frontier judgment that a person doing something unconventional was either ahead of the situation or behind it, and time would tell which. The word Wahnsinn she had heard in October was not being used in November, or not being used where she could hear it. What she heard instead was Graben, still but in a more neutral tone, sometimes followed by Aber warum, which meant but why, and which meant the question was open. She answered the question, when it was asked directly, in the same plain terms she had used to explain everything she understood. The earth below 6 inches is warmer than the surface. The earth against the wall is warmer than the air against the wall. If the wall loses heat to 38 degrees instead of -15, the fire does less work. The fire does less work, the wood lasts longer, the winter does not run out the wood pile before it runs out. It was Martha Hübner who first asked to see it from the inside. Martha was 34, the wife of the settlement's miller, a small, sharp woman who had been in Minnesota Territory for 5 years and who had spent those 5 years watching the settlement's resources and their management with the particular attention of a woman who was responsible for making the resources adequate. Her husband's mill was a business. She understood numbers. She came to the shanty on a Saturday in November, and Hannah let her in, and she stood in the center of the 10 by 12 room and looked at the walls. From the inside, the berming showed as a change in the character of the windows. The windows were now recessed. set back from the outer wall face by the depth of the berm, creating deep window wells that were lined with packed clay. The effect was that the windows, which had been flush with the outer wall, were now looking out through a tunnel of warm earth. The north wall had no window. The east and south windows were recessed by the full berm depth. Marta pressed her hand to the east interior wall. She said, "The wall is warmer than it should be." Hannah said, "The earth behind it is 38 degrees. The wall is losing heat to 38, not to whatever it is outside today." Marta said, "What is it outside today?" Hannah said, 7 degrees. Marta turned and looked at the window recess. She went to the east window and put her hand into the deep window well, pressing the clay side wall of the well. She said, "And this?" Hannah said, "The earth in the berm, about 35 degrees there, because it's deeper from the outside face." Marta said, "And you've been burning how much wood?" Hannah told her. Marta listened. She said, "We burned twice that in October." Hannah said, "Your walls are exposed to the air." Marta looked at the room. She said, "My husband's mill office, north-facing single-plank walls. He comes back from the mill with his beard frozen even when there's a fire." Hannah said nothing. Marta said, "Could you do this to an existing building?" Hannah said, "The berming, yes. The trench for drainage, yes. The straw facing on the outside, yes. It takes perhaps 10 days of digging if the soil is not frozen." She paused. "The soil is frozen now." Marta said, "In the spring." Hannah said, "In the spring." Marta went back to the mill and told her husband, whose name was Georg, who listened and then said it seemed like a great deal of digging for something that might not make a significant difference. Marta said she had pressed her hand to the wall and felt the difference. Georg said a person's hand was not a thermometer. Marta went back to Hannah and borrowed the account book for 2 days. Georg looked at the account book numbers and was quiet for a while, and then said the numbers were interesting. December. The temperature in December dropped below -20 for the first time on December 8th and held there for 4 days. These were the days that the frontier settlement used to calibrate itself. The early, serious cold that told you whether your wood supply and your walls were adequate for what was still ahead, whether January and February would be survived on the resources available, or whether the end of February would arrive before the end of the woodpile. Hannah's account book for the second week of December showed outdoor temperature, morning, -22 degrees. Indoor temperature before fire, morning, 44 degrees. Clay at inner berm face, 32 degrees. Wood burned in 24 hours. One piece, evening stove. A timber frame cabin of equivalent size, thin walls, no insulation, burning to maintain 44 degrees in -22 weather. Was burning 4 to 5 pieces per day. She was burning 1. She wrote the numbers and looked at them. The earth at the inner berm face had dropped to 32 because the sustained cold was drawing the warmth out of the clay mass slowly, the same way sustained cold drew warmth out of anything. But 32 was the freezing point of water. The clay berm was still 32. The air outside was -22. The 54-degree difference between the air and the clay berm was the measure of how much work the earth mass was still doing. On the morning of December 9th, she went outside in the dark to check her outdoor thermometer and the berm face temperature, and she found, at the north berm stake where the outdoor thermometer hung, that the thermometer was not alone. Friedrich Metz was standing there. He had ridden out from the main cabin and tied his horse at the road and walked to the north berm stake and was looking at the outdoor thermometer in the moonlight, reading the number. He had not knocked. He had arrived and was standing in her yard in the dark at 6 in the morning in -22 cold, which was unusual behavior even for a frontier man with ordinary motivations. She said, "Friedrich." He turned around. He had frost on his beard, and his eyes were not angry and they were not calculating. They were the eyes of a man who had been lying awake and had finally done the thing lying awake eventually produced, which was getting up and going to look at the thing you could not stop thinking about. He said, "I read the numbers in Marta Hubner's account book copy." She said, "Yes." He said, "-22 outside." She said, "Yes." He said, "What is it inside?" She said, "I have not checked yet. Come in." He came in. She lit the lamp and checked the interior thermometer. 43 degrees before the morning fire. She showed him the number and showed him the account book where the previous day's readings were recorded. He read the account book standing in her shanty at 43 degrees, at -22 outside. He read it carefully, in the way he had read farm records for 4 years, with the practical attention of a man who had been managing the mathematics of a Minnesota farm and knew what the numbers meant in wood and cost and labor. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "I have been burning 6 pieces a day." She said, "How thick are your walls?" He said, 6-inch log. She said, "And no berming?" He said, "No." She said, 6-inch log walls exposed to -22 are losing heat to a 50-degree difference. The fire replaces the heat as fast as the walls lose it. The fire that replaces it as fast as the walls lose it to -22 is 6 pieces per day. He said, "And yours?" She said, "The earth behind my walls is 32 degrees. My wall is losing heat to a 9-degree difference. The fire that replaces it as fast as the wall loses it to 32 is 1 piece per day." He looked at her for a moment. He said, 1/6. She said, roughly. He said, 1/6 of the wood. She said, "Yes." He said, "For a winter's supply?" She said, "Yes." He sat down in the chair without asking permission and put his elbows on the table and looked at the numbers. He said, "I have 10 cord cut." She said, "You will have 8 cord remaining in spring if you continue as you have been going." She said this without anything in it. She said it as a projection. He said, "If I bermed." She said, "You would have 9 cord remaining. Perhaps 9.5. He said, 1 cord versus 2 cord. She said, "Across a winter, yes, approximately." He was quiet. He was doing the arithmetic. He was the same man who had done the arithmetic in October when Carl died and had arrived at the answer he arrived at, and he was doing the arithmetic now and arriving at a different answer. He said, "Could you help me build the berms on the main cabin?" She said nothing for a moment. He said, "I would pay you for the work." She said, "It is 10 days of digging and hauling and tamping. The soil at the main cabin may be less clay than here, which would make the berm walls harder to hold." He said, "Would you look at it?" She said, "Yes." She looked at the main cabin site 2 days later, in the brief warmth of a December afternoon when the temperature came up to 5 above. The soil at the main cabin's north wall was less clay-heavy than the shanty site, more loam, which was better for farming and worse for berm construction. She assessed the available material and the site geometry and told Friedrich what would work and what would not. She said, "You can berm the north and east walls with the existing soil. It won't pack as tight as the clay at my site, but it will pack adequately if you tamp it in dry weather before it freezes. The west and south walls you can face with straw bales without clay berming, which will give you 70% of the benefit at less digging." He said, "And the trench?" She said, "The trench you dig before you berm, for drainage. 2 feet out, 2 feet deep. The excavated material goes to the berm." He said, "How much of this can I do in December?" She said, "None of the clay work. The clay is frozen. You can set straw bales against the south and west walls now, if you have straw. The clay berming will have to wait until the March thaw." He said, "Will you supervise it?" "In March." She looked at him. He was asking her to return to the main cabin she had been removed from and supervise the work she had pioneered on the shanty he had given her. She understood this was a strange thing to be asked, and she understood what the asking cost him in the specific currency of pride that men in his position spent carefully. She said, "You can pay me in seed, spring rye seed from the seed stock Carl helped build. He said yes. She said, and I want it in writing. He said yes. She drafted the agreement herself in the account book, and they both signed it, which was the first written agreement between them, which was what the original should have been, which was too late to change, and just in time to matter. January came. The account book for January recorded the coldest sustained period of the 1857-58 winter in the Crow Wing County drainage. The temperature dropped below -30 for the first time on January 14th and held there for 9 days, broken by 2 days of cloud cover that pushed the temperature to -15 before dropping again to -31 on January 23rd. The settlement recorded 4 deaths in that 9-day cold snap. A man named August Römer, who had built a single-room frame house on an exposed north-facing claim west of the settlement, was found by his neighbor on January 19th, 3 days after the cold had started. He had been burning wood faster than his pile could sustain and had begun burning furniture, and then the wood of his indoor shutters, and then, on the last day, had been found at the stove with the stove cold and the last of his burnable material exhausted. He had not frozen in the technical sense of the word. His stove had gone out and the cold had come through the walls at the full differential, and he had been dead by morning. A family named Gottschalk, husband and wife and an infant, had been found alive but severely frostbitten on January 20th, the husband's hands and the wife's feet showing the dark color of tissue that had been cold too long. Their cabin had been inadequate for the sustained cold, and they had been burning continuously for 4 days on a wood supply that had not been cut for this severity of winter. They survived. The hands and feet were a different matter. A woman named Clara Siebert, 55, who had been farming with her adult son on the eastern section of the drainage, had sent her son to the settlement for supplies on January 18th, when the temperature was -28 and the roads were passable, and her son had not come back because the temperature had dropped further and the creek crossing had become impassable. She had been alone in the cabin for 4 days. She was found alive, but had been burning her furniture for the last 36 hours. The settlement knew about these 4 situations because the settlement was small enough that everyone knew everyone's situation, and because Gerhard Schreiber's store was the communication hub, and because in a settlement of 31 families at -30, the condition of each family was community information. Hannah knew about them on the evening of January 18th, when she went to Schreiber's for the week's supplies and heard about August Römer from 3 separate sources. She sat in Schreiber's store in the warmth of his main stove and thought about August Römer. She had seen his claim from the road, from single-room frame house, north-facing, no shelter from the ridge above, thin walls, and she had seen the small wood pile and thought about it in the way she thought about everything, which was to note it and file it. She had not gone to talk to him. She was a widow woman of 3 months in a community that had not asked for her opinion of its construction methods, and August Römer was a man who had been farming for 3 years and had made his decisions. She had not offered, and he had not asked, and now he was dead. She rode home in the dark on the horse she had kept from Carl's inventory, the one Friedrich had not taken because it was the older of the 2, and she went inside and fed the stove and sat in the 47-degree shanty and looked at the account book. She looked at her woodpile assessment from January 1st. 4 cord remaining of the original 4 because she had not been burning at the rate she had expected. She had been burning less. She looked at the account book for the past week. Outdoor temperature, January 14th, -31. Indoor temperature before fire, 41. Clay at inner berm face, 29. Wood burned, 2 pieces. Outdoor temperature, January 15th, -30. Indoor temperature before fire, 40. Clay, 28. Wood burned, 2 pieces. The cold was drawing down on the clay berm. The clay was at 28, which was below freezing, which meant the outermost inches of the berm had frozen solid. But 28 degrees was still 28 degrees. The air outside was -30. The wall was still losing heat to a 58-degree differential, not a 71-degree differential. She was still burning less than a third of what an unburned cabin would have burned. She had 3.5 cord remaining. She was going to come through the winter with wood to spare. She thought about August Römer. She thought about the Gottschalks and their hands and feet. She thought about Clara Siebert burning her furniture. On January 21st, when the temperature came up to -18 and the roads were passable again, she went to the settlement. She went to Friedrich Metz's place first, because Friedrich had the main cabin, and the main cabin had the main stove, and the main cabin was the largest building in the immediate area. She said, "I need to borrow your main room for 3 days to teach anyone who wants to come how to build what I built." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "The berming." She said, "Anyone who wants to know how to do it before next winter." She paused. "August Römer is dead." He said, "I know." She said, "The Gottschalks lost fingers." He said, "I know." She said, "How many more winters before the people who built wrong learn to build right?" He was quiet. He said, "Use the main room." She taught for 3 days, the 22nd, 23rd and 24th of January, 1858, in Friedrich Metz's main room in the Crow Wing County settlement. She taught every person who came, and 23 of them came, some from as far as 4 miles up the river. She taught from the account book, showing the numbers. She drew diagrams in chalk on the hearthstone, showing the geometry of the trench and the berm and the straw facing. She explained the reason in plain words. The earth below 6 inches is warmer than the surface. The wall backed by earth loses heat to the earth, not to the air. The difference between the Earth's temperature and the interior temperature is smaller than the difference between the air's temperature and the interior temperature. A smaller difference means a slower heat loss. A slower heat loss means less fire. Less fire means the woodpile lasts. Georg Hübner, Martha's husband, the miller who had said a person's hand was not a thermometer, came on the second day and listened for 2 hours. At the end of the 2 hours he came to Hannah and said, "My mill office, how quickly can this be done in March?" She said, "For a building that size, 12 days. He said, "I'll hire 3 men for the digging." "Will you supervise?" She said, "Yes." She paused. "At the same rate I charged Friedrich Metz." He said, "What rate is that?" She said, "Seed and a written agreement." He said, "I can do better than seed." She said, "I prefer seed." He looked at her. He said, "All right." The 23rd person to come was a woman, which was notable because 21 of the 23 who came were men, because women were supposed to send their husbands for practical building knowledge, and most of them had. The 23rd person was Beta Römer, August Römer's widow, 31 years old, who had buried her husband 4 days ago, and who had 2 children, ages 4 and 2, and who had come from 4 miles in the cold with her eyes flat and her chin up, and who had sat in the back of the room for the entire 3 days of teaching, and had written everything in a small notebook. She came to Hannah at the end of the 3rd day, after everyone else had left, and she said, "August would have listened." Hannah said, "Yes." Beta said, "I don't know if he would have done it. Sometimes knowing and doing are different things." Hannah said, "Yes." Beta said, "But he would have listened." Hannah said, "I'm sorry, about August. He was a careful man." Beta said, "He was." She looked at the notebook in her hand. He was careful about the wrong things. He was careful about the seed rate and the harvest timing. He was not careful about the walls. Hannah said nothing. Beta said, "I am going to build what you built. In March, when the ground thaws." She paused. "I don't have a man to dig it." Hannah said, "I will help you dig." Beate looked at her. She said, "You will come to my claim and help me dig." Hannah said, Yes. Beate said, "Why?" Hannah thought about Karl, who had taught her to look before she touched anything. She thought about August Römer, who had been careful about the wrong things, who had died for want of knowledge that was available and had not reached him. She thought about the account book with its numbers, which said clearly and plainly what was happening and what was possible and what could be done about it. She said, "Because the knowledge does no good sitting in this account book or in my walls. It does good when it is in someone else's walls." Beate nodded. She put the notebook in her coat pocket and went to the door and turned back. She said, "And Friedrich Metz." Hannah said, "What about him?" Beate said, "Everyone knows what he did. With the claim." She paused. "And everyone knows he let you use his main room." Hannah said, "He let me use his room because he read the numbers." Beate said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Is that enough? Hannah thought about Friedrich Metz, who had come to her table in October and done his arithmetic and given her the joke cabin, and who had come to her yard in December in the dark at -22 to read the thermometer, and who had signed a written agreement for the main cabin berming, and who had opened his home for 3 days of teaching without being asked to do more than that. She said, "It is what it is." She paused. "He did not have to let me use the room." Beate said, "No." Hannah said, "He did not have to sign the agreement." Beate said, "No." Hannah said, "He did what the numbers told him was right, not what pride would have told him." Beate said, "Is that virtue?" Hannah said, "It is the version of virtue that keeps people from freezing. I'll take it." February was the last of the hard winter. The February account book showed the accumulated record of a winter that the earth berms had made navigable. The coldest morning was January 23rd at -31, and the indoor temperature that morning before the fire was 38 degrees, which was cold but was not the temperature that killed people. She had burned 2 pieces of wood that day, and the following day, and the day after. She went into February with 2 cord of wood remaining. She came out of February with 1 cord remaining. She burned 1 cord in February, the hardest month. An unburned cabin of her size in that winter burned 3 cord in February. She wrote the final winter's total in the account book on the 1st of March. Total wood burned, October through February, 3 cord. Estimated wood burned by equivalent unburned structure, 8 cord. Differential, 5 cord. 5 cord of wood that had not been cut, not been hauled, not been split, not been fed to a fire that was fighting the full differential of a Minnesota winter through a gap-riddled cottonwood wall. 5 cords worth of warmth that the earth berms had provided, not by generating heat, but by holding it, by standing between the wall and the winter and saying, "This far and no further." She closed the account book and went outside into the first real thaw of March, the mud beginning under the snow crust and the creek ice showing the grey, translucent color of ice that was thinking about becoming water again. She walked to the north berm and pressed her hand into the straw face and then through to the clay behind it. The clay was beginning to soften, the frost retreating upward as the ground temperature recovered. By the end of March, it would be workable again. By the end of March, she would be at Beate Römer's claim, digging. Friedrich Metz had the berming crew at the main cabin in the first week of April, 3 men with spades and a wheelbarrow, Hannah supervising. The main cabin berming took 11 days because the loam soil required more tamping than clay, and because the main cabin had a full cellar on the east side that complicated the east berm geometry. She redesigned the east berm on the 2nd day when she saw the cellar access issue, and Friedrich watched her redesign it in chalk on the cellar doorboards and said nothing except, "Yes, that works." The main cabin berming was complete by April 15th. The straw bales went on the outer faces in the last week of April. By May, the main cabin had the same insulation envelope as the shanty on the North 40 that Friedrich had given Hannah in October. Georg Hübner's mill office was bermed in early May. The berming of the mill office demonstrated the system at a scale and in a location that every person who came to the mill could see and ask about, which was a better demonstration than 3 days of chalk diagrams in a sitting room. By the end of the summer of 1858, 7 structures in the Crow Wing County settlement had been bermed on the Kepler system, which was what the settlement had started calling it, because settlements needed to name things after someone, and Hannah Kepler was this someone they had watched do it first and alone in October, when everyone else was saying Wansin. Hannah did not call it the Kepler system. She called it what it was, which was the trench and berm method, which was not a name she had invented and was not a method she had invented. She had figured it out from pressing her hand into the soil at 6 inches deep and feeling the warmth. But the physics behind what she felt had been understood since people first dug root cellars, since the Romans built their hypocaust floors, since the Norse built their turf houses with walls of packed earth, since any farmer anywhere in any cold country noticed that the ground stayed warmer than the air and put the observation to use. What she had done was apply it to a building's walls rather than its floor, and do it in 6 weeks with a spade and a wheelbarrow and 60 cents worth of straw, alone, in the October of the year her husband died and his partner took the land. The preemption filing she made on the North 40 in November of 1857, recorded at the County Land Office in February of 1858, was confirmed by the Land Office as a valid improvement claim based on her 6 weeks of documented occupation and construction activity. The account book served as her improvement documentation. The county land agent who reviewed it noted that the temperature records constituted unusually systematic evidence of improvement. The 40 acres and the shanty were hers. She expanded the shanty in the summer of 1858, adding a lean-to on the south side that doubled the living area, and bermed the lean-to's north wall as she built it, before she framed the roof. Georg Hübner's carpenter helped with the framing in exchange for 2 more advisory visits about the berm geometry on 2 of his outbuildings. By October of 1858, she had a dwelling of 20 by 12 feet with bermed walls on 3 sides and a roof insulated by 2 layers of sod and a grass and clay layer between them. The account book for the winter of 1858-59 showed 2 cord burned, full winter. Friedrich Metz came to the North 40 in October of 1858 to look at the expanded shanty and the bermed additions, and to tell her that the main cabin's first bermed winter the previous year had used 4 cord, and that he had had 3 cord left at the end of March. He said 3 cord left. She said yes. He said, I sent that to Wisconsin, his wife and children. She understood this meant he had sent the money he would have spent on 3 cord of wood that he had not needed to burn. She said nothing. He said, I want you to look at something. She went with him. He took her to the back of the main cabin, the north slope below the ridge, and he showed her what he had been doing since August when the ground was soft. He had dug the trench himself and built the clay berm himself, working without supervision, using what she had shown him in her account book and what he had watched her do at his cabin in April. The berm was not as good as hers. The tamping was uneven in places, and the straw facing was not as tightly packed as she would have done it, but it was present and it was functional, and he had built it himself. She pressed her hand into the clay berm at its mid-height and felt the warmth. She said, The east corner is loose. You'll want to repack it before it freezes. He said, I know. I was going to ask if you would check it. She said, I'll check it. He stood beside her at the berm he had built from watching her, at the main cabin that was on the land he had taken from her, and he said, I have been thinking about the original agreement. She said, There was no original agreement. That was the problem. He said, Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking that what was taken could be returned in pieces, perhaps over time. She said, What does that mean? He said, The northwest quarter section. 20 acres of the timberland Carl had cleared. He stopped. He said, I can't undo what was done in October. I can offer what I can offer, she said, and the offer is the northwest quarter. He said, yes. She thought about it. 20 acres of cleared timberland, north-facing, which was less valuable for farming than the south-facing cleared land, but was valuable for timber and for the access to the creek drainage it provided. She thought about Carl, who would have taken the offer with his handshake and his good faith. She thought about writing it down. She said, I want it in writing. He said, yes. She said, notarized at the county seat. He said, yes. She said, and the east corner of this berm needs repacking before November. He said, yes. She repacked the east corner herself while Friedrich went to get the coffee because the corner needed doing, and she was there, and it was the kind of work she did not need to be paid for because it was simply the work that needed doing in a place where the doing of it kept people from freezing. The coffee was from Carl's coffee supply, which Friedrich had kept in the main cabin kitchen. She drank it in the kitchen that had been her kitchen, at the table that was still her table, the one she had taken when she left, which she had brought back with her for this visit. If this story made you think differently about what a spade and 60 cents and the knowledge of what the earth does 6 inches down is worth against a Minnesota winter, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. And tell me this, have you ever solved a hard problem with the simplest possible version of the right answer, the answer that was obvious once you saw it and invisible until you did? Because Hannah Kepler dug a trench around a joke of a cabin with a spade and moved the earth against the walls and cut the winter's wood consumption by 60%. And the answer was right there in the soil all along. The same warmth the earth had been holding 6 inches below the surface since before any of them arrived. Tell me about yours. I read every comment. The account books, 4 of them covering the winters of 1857 through 1861, were donated by Hannah Kepler's granddaughter to the Minnesota Historical Society in 1908. They are the oldest systematic record of earth berming as a civilian building insulation technique in the territory. The entry for the morning of January 23, 1858, written in Hannah's careful German script, reads, -31 outside, 38 inside before fire, clay at berm face, 29, wood 2 pieces, the wall holds. The entry for the following morning reads the same, because the following morning was the same, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, through the rest of January and through February and through to the March thaw, the wall holding what it held, the earth doing its part, the fire doing less work than anyone in Crow Wing County had believed a fire could get away with doing in a Minnesota Territory winter. The berm was still visible on 2 of the original structures as late as 1921, the clay faces repointed and the straw facings replaced twice. But the system in place and functioning, the earth warm against the walls at its steady 32 to 38 degrees, while the Minnesota winters did what Minnesota winters did on the other side of the straw. On the outside, -30. On the inside, the wall holds. That was always the whole of it.